In the quiet hours before dawn on a crisp Roman morning, Pope Francis lay in his modest Vatican bedroom, surrounded by an atmosphere thick with both reverence and solemnity. The room, adorned with simple furnishings and holy relics, seemed to hold its breath as medical staff monitored the pontiff's declining condition. Dr. Alessandro Moretti, the Pope's personal physician for over a decade, stood at the bedside, his usually composed demeanor giving way to deep concern. For months, the 86-year-old pontiff had been battling heart complications, but this night marked a definitive turning point that no one could have fully prepared for. The air was heavy with the scent of burning candles and medicinal supplies, creating an almost surreal blend of sacred tradition and modern medicine. Through the large windows overlooking St. Peter's Square, the first hints of daylight began to creep in, casting long shadows across the papal apartments. Nurses moved quietly about their duties, their soft-soled shoes making barely a sound on the marble floors, while Vatican officials maintained a respectful distance outside the chamber doors, understanding that history was unfolding within these walls. What made this moment particularly poignant was the stark contrast between the grandeur of the papacy and the intimate vulnerability of human mortality. Here lay Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the man who had revolutionized the Catholic Church with his progressive reforms and unwavering commitment to social justice, now facing the inevitable end that awaits all mortals. His breathing had become increasingly labored throughout the night, each inhalation accompanied by a faint wheezing sound that resonated through the silent room like a mournful hymn. Dr. Moretti glanced at the heart monitor, noting how the once steady rhythm had begun to falter. He'd seen countless patients reach this critical juncture, yet something about this particular vigil felt profoundly different. Perhaps it was the weight of responsibility he felt toward not just a patient, but a global spiritual leader, whose decisions had touched millions of lives worldwide. Or maybe it was the realization that this wasn't merely the passing of a religious figure, but the conclusion of an era defined by unprecedented openness and reform within the Church. As morning approached, the situation became increasingly dire. The Pope's complexion had taken on a grayish hue, and his usually alert eyes seemed to struggle to focus on those around him. Yet even in these final moments, there remained an aura of peace about him, a testament to the life he had led, and the legacy he was leaving behind. It was clear to everyone present that they were witnessing not just the end of a remarkable life, but the culmination of a journey that had fundamentally changed the face of Catholicism in the modern world. Dr. Alessandro Moretti found himself paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming realization as he watched the monitors displaying Pope Francis's vital signs. The numbers told a story he had known intellectually but hadn't fully grasped until this moment. The pontiff's heart was failing rapidly, and there was nothing more medicine could do. What struck him most profoundly wasn't just the physical deterioration, but rather the symbolic weight of what was happening. As he studied the Pope's peaceful expression, despite the obvious distress his body was enduring, Moretti understood that this wasn't merely the end of a life, it was the closing chapter of a revolution in faith that had spanned nearly a decade. The doctor's mind raced back through the countless examinations and conversations he'd shared with the pontiff. He recalled how, during routine checkups, Pope Francis would often steer discussions away from his health and toward matters of social justice, environmental stewardship, and ecclesiastical reform. These weren't casual topics for the Pope, they represented the very essence of his papacy. Now, as Moretti watched the man who had challenged centuries of tradition slip away, he realized the true magnitude of what was being lost, not just a beloved religious leader, but a transformative force that had reshaped the Catholic Church's approach to the modern challenges. A wave of professional inadequacy washed over Moretti as he recognized the limitations of his medical expertise in this sacred context. Despite his years of training and experience, he understood that the tools at his disposal were powerless against the natural progression of time and the weight of destiny. The realization forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes, even the most skilled hands must yield to forces beyond human control. This wasn't just another patient succumbing to illness, it was history unfolding before his eyes, and he was merely a witness to something far greater than himself. The gravity of the situation crystallized in Moretti's mind as he observed the subtle changes in the Pope's breathing pattern. Each labored breath carried not just the physical strain of a failing heart, but the collective hopes and dreams of 1 billion Catholics worldwide. The doctor's clinical detachment melted away, replaced by an acute awareness of participating in a moment that would be recorded in history books and discussed in theological circles for generations to come. He understood now that his role transcended traditional medical boundaries. He was present at the threshold where mortality met immortality, where human limitation intersected with divine purpose. As Pope Francis drifted in and out of consciousness, his thoughts seemed to linger on a conversation from weeks earlier, a decision he had made regarding the Vatican's response to the clergy abuse crisis. Through his weakening grasp on lucidity, he replayed the moment when he had chosen diplomatic caution over immediate action, prioritizing institutional stability over swift justice. This compromise, though strategically sound, had gnawed at his conscience ever since. In his final hours, clarity emerged from the fog of impending mortality. He had perhaps waited too long to implement the sweeping reforms he knew were necessary. The regret manifested in subtle ways, a slight furrowing of his brow, an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Those closest to him might have mistaken these gestures for physical discomfort, but they stemmed from a deeper source of anguish. He had always believed in the power of gradual change, of working within the system to effect transformation. Yet now, as his life's work hung in delicate balance, he questioned whether this approach had been too timid, too accommodating to those who resisted progress. His thoughts turned to the survivors he had met during his papacy, their stories etched into his memory with painful precision. The young woman who had wept in his arms after recounting her ordeal, the elderly man who had waited decades for acknowledgement of his suffering, their faces blurred together in his mind's eye, forming a mosaic of pain and resilience that haunted him more intensely with each passing moment. The documents awaiting his signature, the investigations poised to launch, would they proceed without his guiding hand? Would his successors maintain the same level of commitment to addressing these atrocities? The weight of unfinished business pressed heavily upon him. He had envisioned a comprehensive reckoning, one that would cleanse the Church of its darkest secrets and restore trust among the faithful. Instead, he found himself confronting the possibility that his legacy might be remembered more for what remained unaccomplished than for what had been achieved. The Church's healing process, which he had hoped to accelerate during his final years, now seemed destined to continue at a slower pace, potentially losing momentum under future leadership. As consciousness ebbed and flowed, Pope Francis wrestled with the paradox of his own teachings. He had preached about embracing vulnerability and acknowledging human fallibility, yet here he was, grappling with his own perceived shortcomings in the arena where it mattered most. The irony wasn't lost on him, even in his diminished state. His last regret wasn't one of personal failure, but of institutional delay, the knowledge that his cautious approach might have prolonged the suffering of those who had already endured too much. The room grew quieter as Pope Francis's breathing slowed, each exhalation carrying whispers of wisdom accumulated over 8 decades of life. Dr. Moretti noticed how the pontiff's lips moved slightly, forming words that seemed to transcend the physical realm. Though barely audible, these final utterances revealed profound insights into the nature of faith, forgiveness, and human connection. "Love is never wasted," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of countless homilies delivered to millions, yet maintaining an intimacy that spoke directly to those present. "Even our smallest acts of kindness ripple outward, touching lives we'll never know." As consciousness flickered like candlelight in the breeze, Pope Francis seemed to distill his entire papacy into these fleeting moments. "Remember," he continued, his words punctuated by labored breaths, "the Church exists not for itself, but for humanity. We are shepherds, yes, but also servants." The medical staff paused their ministrations, recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just the passing of a religious leader, but the crystallization of a lifetime's worth of spiritual understanding. His gaze, though growing dim, still held the spark of revelation as he added, "True power lies not in authority, but in vulnerability. God speaks loudest through our brokenness." These reflections took on added poignancy when considered against the backdrop of his papacy. Here was a man who had famously eschewed many trappings of his office, choosing instead to live in a modest apartment and drive himself around the Vatican grounds. His final words served as both summation and challenge to those who would carry forward his vision of a more accessible, compassionate church. "Do not mistake comfort for faith," he whispered, his voice growing weaker. "The path of Christ is uncomfortable, demanding, beautiful, The irony wasn't lost on anyone present, that these profound truths emerged most clearly at the moment when human faculties were failing, suggesting that perhaps true wisdom reveals itself most purely when stripped of worldly distractions. As the first light of dawn painted the Vatican walls with golden hues, the pontiff's breathing settled into a rhythm that seemed to mirror the ebb and flow of history itself. Each pause between breaths stretched longer, creating spaces where time appeared to stand still. The medical team exchanged knowing glances, their years of experience telling them that the end was approaching swiftly now. Yet there was something extraordinary about this transition. Rather than a mere cessation of life, it felt like the gentle folding of one chapter into another, where the physical presence was merely giving way to something eternal. The atmosphere in the room transformed subtly as Pope Francis's final breaths merged with the awakening city outside. Birds began their morning songs, their melodies intertwining with the distant chimes of church bells marking the hour. It was as if creation itself was acknowledging the passing of its shepherd, paying tribute through the simple beauty of a new day breaking over Rome. The medical equipment's beeping slowed, then ceased altogether, yet the silence that followed wasn't empty. It carried the weight of countless prayers offered, sermons preached, and lives touched by this singular figure. What transpired next defied easy explanation. Some witnesses later claimed they felt a palpable shift in the room's energy, as if the spirit of reform and compassion that had defined this papacy lingered momentarily before ascending. Others noted how the early morning light seemed to intensify, bathing the pontiff's peaceful features in an otherworldly glow. Regardless of individual interpretation, all present agreed on one thing: this wasn't merely the end of a life, but the beginning of a legacy that would continue to shape the Catholic Church for generations to come. The transition from mortal existence to spiritual influence occurred not with dramatic flourish, but with the same quiet dignity that had characterized Pope Francis's entire ministry. The impact of Pope Francis's passing rippled through the Catholic Church and beyond with unprecedented force, setting off a chain reaction of responses that reflected both the depth of his influence and the complexity of his legacy. Within hours, world leaders began issuing statements that went far beyond conventional expressions of condolence, instead framing his death as a pivotal moment in global spiritual leadership. President Macron of France described him as a revolutionary in shepherd's clothing, while Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany highlighted how the pontiff had bridged political divides during Europe's most challenging times. These responses weren't mere formalities, they signaled a recognition that the Church had lost not just a religious figurehead, but a significant player in international diplomacy and social reform. Within Vatican walls, the atmosphere shifted dramatically as cardinals and bishops grappled with the reality of proceeding without their reform-minded leader. Traditionalists who had long opposed Francis's progressive agenda found themselves unexpectedly bereft, having grown accustomed to his charismatic leadership, even as they disagreed with his methods. Meanwhile, the Church's younger clergy and laity expressed profound anxiety about the future direction of Catholicism. Social media platforms erupted with testimonials from marginalized communities worldwide, sharing how the Pope's advocacy for climate action, refugee rights and LGBTQ+ inclusion had given them hope and validation within their faith. The global Catholic community responded with an outpouring of grief and reflection that transcended cultural and linguistic barriers. In Manila, thousands gathered outside the cathedral, their candlelight vigil transforming into an impromptu celebration of the pontiff's achievements. Similar scenes unfolded in Buenos Aires, where locals remembered their native son not just as a pope, but as a neighborhood priest who had never forgotten his roots. The Church's charitable organizations reported an immediate surge in donations and volunteer sign-ups, as if the faithful sought to honor their departed leader through action rather than mere words. Yet beneath this surface unity lay complex currents of tension and uncertainty. Conservative elements within the Church hierarchy began discreet maneuvers to roll back some of Francis's more controversial reforms, particularly regarding divorced and remarried Catholics' participation in communion. Progressive voices countered with equal determination, vowing to protect and expand upon the groundwork laid during his papacy. This ideological tug-of-war played out in seminaries, parish councils, and theological debates worldwide, suggesting that the true measure of Pope Francis's legacy would emerge not in immediate reactions, but in the Church's ability to navigate these competing visions for its future. As the initial shock of Pope Francis's passing began to settle, the Catholic Church found itself at a crossroads that would define its trajectory for decades to come. The conclave convened in an atmosphere charged with both anticipation and apprehension, as cardinals from diverse backgrounds and theological perspectives gathered to select a successor who could either build upon or potentially dismantle the late pontiff's legacy. Traditionalists saw an opportunity to recalibrate the Church's course, advocating for a return to more conservative interpretations of doctrine, while reformers pushed for candidates who would continue expanding the boundaries of Catholic social teaching. This ideological divide manifested in heated debates within the Sistine Chapel, where the weight of shaping the Church's future rested heavily on each cardinal's shoulders. The selection process revealed deeper systemic challenges facing the institution. Younger clergy expressed concerns about the Church's relevance in an increasingly secular world, pointing to declining attendance figures and the growing disconnect between official teachings and contemporary social values. Meanwhile, older members of the hierarchy emphasized the importance of maintaining doctrinal purity, arguing that compromise had weakened the Church's moral authority. This generational divide complicated efforts to identify common ground, forcing the College of Cardinals to confront fundamental questions about the nature of Catholic identity in the 21st century.